Well, hello there, all. I hope you all are doing well and staying safe out there, and that all that you know are staying safe out there too. Today we are back for some more poetry, and I came up with an interesting idea for our poetry class today, kind of in following what I started on fiction yesterday. So I am thinking that I will start our poetry class with a prompt today, which I have not been doing very much up to this point. Um, and the prompt is very much inspired by where we're all at right now. The prompt I selected was sometimes I feel stuck when dot dot dot. Okay, and then you finish the poem. All right, but I had an idea. Before I share the poems that I wrote with that prompt, I wanted to share with you guys some ideas about how it's easy to get stuck writing poetry that might be a little too simple or a little too not poetic, I guess is the best way to put it. I wanted to discuss some of those initial inspirations and then share with you what I think poetry does really, really well. So I realize I'm not explaining that super, super well right now. So rest assured, I've got some examples of what I'm talking about. But I feel like when I have a prompt, sometimes it's easy to answer that prompt very honestly, but it's also easy to forget to be poetic about it. So what does poetry really mean is really the question of the day. And I think there are a lot of different answers to that question, but I think the sort of baseline of where poetry really gets fun is exploring ways to say something with interesting uses of your language. Okay, that's the crux of what's going on in poetry, where poetry gets really entertaining and really fun, is that it's not just a regular everyday thought that you write down as a poem. It's something that you have concocted through your use of words in an interesting, or shall we say creative way. Okay, so let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. This is what I would consider could be ways to continue that prompt that might be very truthful, but not necessarily poetic. Okay, so here are my sort of just very quick ideas about how you could continue this prompt, but might lack a little bit of poetry. Okay, so sometimes I feel stuck when is our prompt. And my first thought that I came up with when I was thinking about that prompt is sometimes I feel stuck when I have to stay home. Okay, so that's a very honest thought. I'm sure it's a thought that many of you can relate with. It's very truthful to my experience, and yet I don't think it really gets at the heart of what poetry is. It's kind of just answering the question in a very, very simple way. So honest, truthful, interesting, but ultimately maybe it lacks a little bit of poetry. Here's another one that I feel like is honest, but might not be as poetic as it could be. Okay? Sometimes I feel stuck when I can't think of what I wanted to say. Okay, so I'm sure this is something we can also all relate with. When you are trying to find that thing that you're trying to say and you feel stuck in that moment, is a very, very honest feeling. But the way that I use language in my response to that prompt, I would argue, is not necessarily poetic as much as it is a little bit more factual and a little bit more ho-hum, if you will. Okay. So I have a couple more examples of what I think would be a very, very simple way to continue this prompt, but maybe doesn't push forward into what sounds and feels like poetry. Poetry is about creatively using language to express a feeling that you have going on, or a feeling that is going on in the world maybe somebody else has. Okay, so here's another one that might not be my best piece of poetry, but certainly is truthful. Sometimes I feel stuck when I'm in the rat race, okay? The everyday life of just trying to get stuff done and take care of business and make sure you're all taken care of and everything. The rat race there. Sometimes we can all feel like we're on a hamster. We're a hamster on a wheel, running our hearts out, but we're not getting anywhere. Okay. Very simple response to the prompt, but it needs more. I need to. That's where it's really coming down to. Some of these responses could be the beginning of a poem, perhaps, but just as they're left in a short, simple response, isn't quite getting at what we're trying to do with exploring poetry. So I'm sharing these because I'm wondering if some of you might run into some of these traps, which I myself run into just as frequently. Okay, I have to write sometimes a few bad lines before I get a good one. And not that these are bad lines as much as they lack poetry, or they lack a poetic feel, if you will. Here's another one that I think is just a little too simple, a little too straightforward, a little too much to the point, if you will. Sometimes I feel stuck when there aren't any good options. Okay, now there's something I bet a lot of us can relate with. But is the way I'm using the language really elevating it to this level of poetry? I don't know. All right, I got a couple more for you. Sometimes I feel stuck when I want to go out. That's very, very applicable to these times, and very true and very honest, and yet needs more. What are you trying to say there exactly, Zach? Come on. All right, my last one. Sometimes I feel stuck when I'm in bumper to bumper traffic. I'm sure it's been a little while since any of us have been into bumper to bumper traffic, but when I am, I feel especially stuck, especially when you can't see what's going on in front of you and you don't know why you're stopped or in bumper to bumper traffic or whatever. These are all a nice place to start, but you need to go further down the path if you are going to really try to express something poetically. Okay? So now that I've shared all of these examples of how you could answer this prompt and yet still not quite get to that poetic thing, all right? Now I'm going to share with you 2 attempts of mine to try to make a piece of poetry out of this prompt. Okay, so now we're shifting into what I would consider little poems. Okay, and why are they little poems? This is a really good question for all of us to be asking ourselves, those of us who are trying to write poetry. Okay, so poem number 1. Sometimes I feel stuck when claustrophobia comes to greet me like an old friend and wraps me in her embrace. She squeezes like a python that has skipped too many meals. Okay, so There we have ourselves what I would consider a short poem, okay? And because our prompt is about feeling stuck, I wanted to explore the idea of claustrophobia. You know, claustrophobia is when you feel like the walls are kind of closing in on you and you don't have a lot of space around you. And I wanted to personify claustrophobia. Okay, now this word is a word I've been bringing up a lot in our poetry classes because it's very important to personify something. Means to take an idea or something that is not alive and talk about it as if it's alive. So I personify claustrophobia as an old friend first that wraps you in their embrace. And then I personify claustrophobia as a python that has skipped too many meals, that is squeezing too tightly. Now, I hope this is not an experience that any of us have had, because that could be very, very scary. And I'm betting that none of us have been wrapped up in a python's embrace. But we can imagine that feeling and how you might feel claustrophobic. So that, I hope, might inspire you to take your first ideas a little bit farther away from reality and explore, fantasy, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. The rules of reality do not have to apply to poetry. And I think that's one of the really beautiful things about poetry, is that you can discuss the idea of claustrophobia as an old friend or a python or many, many other things. Okay? And that's what I'm trying to sort of bring into focus for you guys today. All right, I've got one more little poem that I wrote on this same exact prompt. Okay? Sometimes I feel stuck when I cannot see the path ahead. It's blocked by a thick fog, overgrown by vines, too tangled to detach. My feet have grown too heavy to lift. My steps cannot be heard. I want to strike out on my own, but I haven't a compass or the stars. Okay, so here is another example of, so now I'm not using the personification mode right now. Now I'm really using imagery. Okay, I'm trying to paint a picture. This is something else I've brought up several times in our poetry classes. And I'm trying to describe the feeling of being stuck in seeing a path ahead of you, as a lot of us do in a lot of our lives. We have a sense of where we might be headed. And there's some comfort in that. And I think that when we're feeling stuck, a lot of us don't have that sense of what's ahead, or we can't see it. And so I decided to use imagery of a path, a literal path in the woods, that is hard to see. It's blocked by a thick fog, overgrown by vines, too tangled to detach. Okay, these are things that I've experienced when I've been in very, very thick forests and stuff like that. They're pulled from my real life, but I'm using them to describe a feeling instead of real life. So this poem is not about actually going down a path in the woods. It's about the feeling of feeling stuck, and then using that imagery to describe the feeling. And then I talk about my body, my feet having grown too heavy to lift, my steps that cannot be heard. I think that's a very interesting idea to think about. Even if you are making your way forward, not hearing your footsteps could be very unnatural feeling, or very fantasy-esque, if you will. My steps that cannot be heard. Oh, and then this final line, I was pleased with where I ended up with this small piece of poetry. I want to strike out on my own, but haven't a compass or the stars. Now, I'm pretty sure most of you understand why a compass would be good for striking out on your own. You need to know what direction you're headed in. But for those of you who are not aware, a lot of sailors in the older times, and still to this day actually, when their compasses are not working on their boats, use the stars to navigate their path. The North Star particularly is very, very important to anyone on the ocean, because on an ocean you don't have landmarks to really keep your idea of where you're headed. And so you can easily lose track of where you are in the ocean, if you will. So I was trying to get at this idea of needing to strike out on your own when you're feeling stuck, and yet you don't have the typical tools to navigate your way. So this second piece is much more about imagery and exploring images that describe a feeling. Those are things that I consider useful within poetry. Do I think that both of these poems are quintessential poetry? Absolutely not. I think it's just, my best effort at trying to discuss the differences between everyday speech and what poetry really is. It's very difficult to actually define what poetry is, because it's always changing. It's and it's always taking new forms, and it's about employing language in a way that you wouldn't expect. That's the key to writing a good piece of poetry, I think, in my humble opinion. I'm certainly not the end-all be-all expert of what poetry is, but I'm trying to think about it through your eyes and minds, if you will, and try to think about where maybe you potentially get stuck when you're trying to do these lessons with me. So I hope that each of you will take a moment and try to write a couple of different poems about using this prompt, this very first line. Sometimes I feel stuck when. And then explore personification. Explore talking about something that is not alive as if it were alive. Or explore imagery. Try to paint a picture, and remember, the picture doesn't have to be realistic, okay? Try to paint a picture that expresses a feeling. I think those are great ways to start getting a bit more poetic with your use of language, instead of just saying what you're feeling. While it may be truthful, it may not be as poetic. All right, you guys, I hope you have fun. And I'll be checking in with you all soon.